My name is Tamar Dekanosidze, and I'm speaking on behalf of Equality Now, which works globally to protect the rights of women and girls. Together with 16 other human rights organizations, we submitted a report to the UN Human Rights Council addressing the issues of sexual violence. I will be talking about the following areas related to the rights of women and girls: sexual violence, child prostitution, which is the sexual exploitation of children, harmful practices such as child marriage, and women and girls with disabilities. During the second cycle, Georgia received a number of very important recommendations to uphold women's rights and combat violence against women. Since then, the government of Georgia has indeed taken a number of very important measures in various areas of women's rights. These include, for example, the ratification of the Istanbul Convention, amending various laws, and improving criminal justice mechanisms to fight violence against women. A number of important challenges still remain, however. Sexual violence is one of the few areas where the legislation of Georgia still does not comply with the Istanbul Convention and other human rights standards. In addition, extremely inflexible evidentiary requirements are applied to prove rape. This denies survivors of sexual violence justice. We urge the government of Georgia to introduce a consent-based definition of rape and remove burdensome evidence requirements to prove sexual violence. Child prostitution, which is the sexual exploitation of children, is another area where the legislation of Georgia still does not comply with the Council of Europe's Lanzarote Convention. The law does not criminalize buying sex from a minor, which results in the impunity of perpetrators, particularly those who commit this abuse against girls from 16 to 18. Law envisages administrative penalties against the victims. We urge the government of Georgia to criminalize buying sex from a minor and remove administrative penalties from survivors. Currently, 14% of Georgian women are still married as children. This is a violation of the rights of women and girls. We urge the government of Georgia to target the root causes of child marriage by strengthening educational, social, and other support measures. Women and girls with disabilities face specific challenges in accessing justice, and we urge the government of Georgia to put in place specific guidelines for justice professionals so that these women can access justice. We believe that the full realization of the rights of women and girls and of all human beings is only possible with targeting the root causes of structural and systemic inequality and promoting substantive and transformative change. Thank you very much for your attention and your action.
This statement is provided on behalf of Association HERA 21 and Sexual Rights Initiative. The organizations would like to bring the attention of member states to the issues concerning right to health, specifically whole life cycle approach of sexual and reproductive health in primary health care, access to safe abortion, and access to family planning services for rural women and girls. In 2015, government of Georgia accepted recommendations of Denmark, Rwanda, Algeria, Brazil, and Belarus regarding access to health care. However, failure to allocate sufficient resources, weak primary health care system, and poor gatekeeping role were key barriers to address. In addition to this, there is no SRHR indicators integrated in primary health care system. There is no integration of minimum initial reproductive health package for emergency and response plan of Ministry of Healthcare at all. Lockdown and subsequent restrictions left rural women and girls isolated without access to information and essential SRH services. In 2015, Georgia also accepted recommendation regarding access to safe abortion services, but in reality it failed in implementing this recommendation. women and girls in Georgia still face stigma and discrimination and violation of fundamental rights to bodily autonomy, bodily integrity, and the attainment of the highest standard of health. Legal regulatory framework governing safe abortion and mandatory waiting time are key issues also to be addressed. These issues contradict WHO recommendation and violates women's access to safe abortion. The law of Georgia on healthcare prohibits abortion advertisement. As a result, in Georgia, there is no access to scientific right information on safe abortion methods. In 2015, Georgia also received some recommendation regarding ensuring access to quality SRH services, including contraceptive services for rural women and girls. But in reality, girls in Georgia in rural areas are facing accessibility barriers, and there is no access to sexuality education for them as well. There is no integration of contraception in state universal healthcare package for vulnerable groups of population. Due to the unmet need of contraception, approximately 66% of rural women of fertile age are left without access to any kind of contraceptive methods. Therefore, we would like to recommend the government of Georgia to develop and integrate sexual and reproductive health indicators in primary health care for all age groups of population during whole life cycle approach. Revised law on health care of Georgia to completely remove abortion advertisement. Integrate minimum initial service package for reproductive health in state emergency and preparedness plan of Ministry of Healthcare. Ensure integration of contraception in state universal healthcare package for socially vulnerable groups of population, including women, youth, and internally displaced persons. We would like to thank you for your attention and would like to invite you to consult on our advocacy fact sheets available at UPR Info webpage.
Dear delegates, this video statement is presented by Women's Initiative Supporting Group, non-governmental organization advocating for LGBTQI persons' rights in Georgia for almost 20 years. We've been engaged to the UPR process during the second cycle, as well as submitted relevant report and fact sheet for this current session. During the previous cycle, Georgian government had received 9 recommendations in regards to sexual orientation and gender identity, out of which 8 has been submitted. The majority of these recommendations were directed to eliminate social stigma towards LGBTIQ persons. As far as no positive measures had been taken by the government, an existing stigma continues manifesting itself in institutional homophobia, which results in the homophobic transphobic hate crimes. Despite the frequency and brutality of such crimes, the victims often refrain from reporting the crimes against them because of the fear of forcible coming out and victimization, which results in a gap between official and the NGO statistics. Given that the non-existence of the unified statistical data on hate crimes, it's impossible to determine the real number of SOGI-based hate crimes. The mentioned stigma, as well as the non-efficiency of state policies, result in an infringement of the right to freedom of expression and assembly for this group, always opposed through the threats coming from third-party far-right groups, even though those far-right groups publicly incite the violence against the LGBTQI persons. There has been no case when the criminal liability was imposed against the perpetrator or any attempt of the state to reduce the polarization. So that we recommend the Georgian government to integrate the SOGI issues to all educational campaigns addressing policing, criminal justice system, and civil society, and as well as in line with Sweden's recommendations under the previous UPR session to establish the special hate crime investigation units that could, within the law enforcement agencies, to strengthen the investigation, prosecution, and prevention of hate crimes. trans persons continue to be the most marginalized groups in Georgia. As long as their legal gender recognition is not regulated under the law, an existing practice requires them to undergo medically unjustified, unwanted, expensive, and even more life-threatening surgical procedures in order to change their gender marker in official documents. In addition, another problem faced by the trans group is related to the healthcare system. There is no clinical guidelines and protocols that could underwrite the procedural rules in regards to trans-specific medical health care. So that we recommend the government of Georgia to amend the law to regulate the legal gender recognition in a way that it was based on the self-determination of trans persons, exempt from abusive requirement, and was a simple administrative procedure, as well as to adopt the clinical guidelines and protocols due to trans persons in line with the international standards. These and other shortcomings in regards to LGBTQI persons, as well as the scrutinized recommendations, can be found in the submission and the relevant fact sheet. For now, many thanks for your attention.
მოგესალმებით, მე ვარ ნანა გოჩიაშვილი, წარმოვადგენ არასამთავრობო ორგანიზაციას პარტნიორობა ადამიანის უფლებებისთვის. დღეს მინდა გაგაცნოთ კოალიცია თანასწორობისათვის მიერ მომზადებული ანგარიში, რომელიც გაეგზავნა გაეროში და რომელიც მიმოიხილავს საქართველოში სხვადასხვა ჯგუფების უფლებრივ მდგომარეობას. კონკრეტულად ორი თემა, რომელზეც დღეს გესაუბრებით, ეს არის ბავშვებისა და შეზღუდული შესაძლებლობის მქონე პირთა უფლებების დაცვის საკითხი საქართველოში. თავდაპირველად გაგაცნობთ იმ გამოწვევებს, რომელიც არსებობს ქვეყანაში ბავშვის უფლებების დაცვის მიმართულებით და ვისაუბრებ იმ 4 რეკომენდაციაზე, რომელიც საქართველოს სახელმწიფომ მიიღო UPR-ის მეორე ციკლის ფარგლებში და რომელიც სამწუხაროდ არ შესრულებულა. ეს არის ბავშვთა სიღარიბე და ბავშვების ცხოვრება დიდი ზომის რეზიდენტულ დაწესებულებებში. საქართველოში ყოველი მეხუთე ბავშვი ცხოვრობს უკიდურეს სიღარიბეში, ხოლო 6.8% ცხოვრობს საარსებო მინიმუმის ზღვარს ქვემოთ. სამწუხარო არის ის, რომ ეს მაჩვენებელი ყოველწლიურად იზრდება, კერძოდ 2017 წელს 2015 წელთან შედარებით 4.8%-ით არის გაზრდილი ბავშვების რაოდენობა, რომელიც ცხოვრობს საარსებო მინიმუმის ზღვარს ქვემოთ. ეს ყველაფერი შედეგად იწვევს იმას, რომ ბავშვების ოჯახურ გარემოში ცხოვრების უფლება ირღვევა, კერძოდ ხდება ბავშვების სიღარიბის გამო ოჯახებიდან გამოყვანა და ასევე მათი ცხოვრება დიდი ზომის დაწესებულებებში. დღეისათვის 1500-მდე ბავშვი განაგრძობს ცხოვრებას დიდი ზომის დაწესებულებაში და აქედან 900-მდე ბავშვი არალიცენზირებულში. სამწუხარო არის ის, რომ არალიცენზირებულ დაწესებულებებში დღემდე ვერ ხორციელდება სახელმწიფოს მონიტორინგი და შესაბამისად არ ვიცით, როგორი არის ამ დაწესებულებებში ბავშვების უფლებების დაცვის საკითხი. შესაბამისად მნიშვნელოვანი არის, რომ საქართველოს სახელმწიფომ 2023 წლამდე შეიმუშაოს ბავშვთა სიღარიბის დაძლევის სტრატეგია და დაუყოვნებლივ დაიწყოს არალიცენზირებული დაწესებულებებიდან ბავშვების გამოყვანა. ამისათვის აუცილებელი არის, რომ მოხდეს ყველა დაწესებულების შეფასება და ის დაწესებულებები, რომლებიც ვერ მიიღებენ ლიცენზიას, ბავშვები დაუყოვნებლივ იქნენ გამოყვანილნი. ხოლო 2025 წლამდე მოხდეს ყველა ბავშვის გამოყვანა, მათ შორის ლიცენზირებული დაწესებულებებიდან და მათი განთავსება მინდობით აღზრდაში ან მათი დაბრუნება ბიოლოგიურ მშობლებთან. რაც შეეხება მეორე საკითხს, შეზღუდული შესაძლებლობის მქონე პირთა უფლებების დაცვის მდგომარეობას, ორ საკითხზე გავამახვილებ თქვენს ყურადღებას. პირველი ეს არის კონვენციის დამატებითი ოქმის რატიფიცირება, რომელიც ასევე მოხდა მეორე ციკლის ფარგლებში და საქართველოს სახელმწიფომ 5 რეკომენდაცია მიიღო აღნიშნულ თემასთან დაკავშირებით. სამწუხაროდ დღემდე არ მომხდარა კონვენციის დამატებითი ოქმის რატიფიცირება, რაც შეზღუდული შესაძლებლობის მქონე პირებს საშუალებას არ აძლევს, რომ ინდივიდუალურად მიმართონ საკუთარი უფლებების დარღვევის აღმოსაფხვრელად გაეროს შეზღუდული შესაძლებლობის მქონე პირთა უფლებების დაცვის კომიტეტს. და მეორე საკითხი ეს არის ფსიქიკური ჯანმრთელობის სფეროს განვითარება, რომელიც წარმოადგენს ერთ-ერთ ყველაზე უფრო რთულ პრობლემას ქვეყანაში შეზღუდული შესაძლებლობის მქონე პირთა უფლებების დაცვის მიმართულებით. იქედან გამომდინარე, რომ არ არის განვითარებული სათემო სერვისები და თემზე დაფუძნებული მომსახურებები, 10-მდე დიდი ზომის ფსიქიატრიულ დაწესებულებაში ადამიანები უვადოდ ცხოვრობენ. იმისათვის, რომ ეს პრობლემა აღმოიფხვრას, მნიშვნელოვანი არის, რომ შემდეგი 5 წლის განმავლობაში საქართველოს სახელმწიფომ ჩადოს რესურსები სათემო სერვისების განვითარებაში და 30%-ით შეამციროს დიდი ზომის ფსიქიატრიულ დაწესებულებებში ცხოვრები ადამიანების რაოდენობა. მადლობას გიხდით ყურადღებისათვის და დამატებითი ინფორმაცია შეგიძლიათ იხილოთ UPR Info-ს ოფიციალურ გვერდზე.
My name is Lina Khmenianidze and I represent Human Rights Education and Monitoring Center. This statement addressing to the special need to protect social and economic rights in Georgia has been jointly prepared by EMC, PHR and GAILA. At the beginning, I will start with the work and employment, which is one of the most violated rights in Georgia, expressed in the high rate of death and injury of workers and widespread labor exploitation in all economic sectors. 2 months ago, the Parliament of Georgia adopted a new labor code and established a fully fledged labor inspection. Despite these positive changes, labor legislation still does not contain a minimum basic labor guarantees, and labor inspection is characterized by a massive shortage of resources. At the same time, the lack of basic social guarantees for workers, especially for informal workers, became one of the biggest human rights issues, especially in the light of COVID-19 pandemic. There is no real minimum wage in the country. We don't have unemployment benefit or insurance schemes. In this context, we have 3 key recommendations: to enhance labor inspection with adequate financial and human resources in order to implement labor legislation, to introduce a basic social protection guarantees for workers such as real minimum wage, unemployment benefit or insurance schemes, and to introduce a national action plan and strategy to formalization of informal economic sector that will be taken into account the needs and interests of informal workers. Now I will move to the second topic, right to housing, which is one of the most stressing issues in this country. Despite the scope of the problem, we don't have any strategy or action plan or coordination mechanism or proper legislation to fight against homelessness. Now I will move to the right to housing, which is one of the most problematic issues in the country. Despite the scope of the problem, there is no any strategy, action plan, coordination mechanism, or proper legislation to fight against homelessness. And this hard situation is even complicated by the massive lack of social and housing services. Every year, hundreds of Georgian families face eviction. In addition, there is no proper legislation on evictions which will take into account even basic standards of the right to housing. During the pandemic, the government of Georgia declared a national moratorium on evictions, which was a positive step. But as pandemic ends, we know that we will face massive waves of evictions that will affect hundreds and thousands of Georgian families. With this in mind, we have 3 main recommendations: to elaborate a national strategy and action plan to cope with the homelessness that will take into account the needs and interests of homeless population of Georgia; to elaborate a new legislation on evictions which will take into account the basic international standards of the right to housing; and to expand national moratorium on evictions beyond the end of the pandemic till the new legislation on evictions enter into force. Detailed information of our recommendations and observations will be on the website of UPR Info. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
წარმოგიდგენთ ადამიანის უფლებების სწავლებისა და მონიტორინგის ცენტრისა და საქართველოს ახალგაზრდა იურისტთა ასოციაციის ერთობლივ წარდგინებას. მინდა ვისაუბრო სასამართლოში არსებულ პრობლემებთან დაკავშირებით. ეს ჩვენი ქვეყნისთვის ძალიან მნიშვნელოვანი პრობლემაა და ბევრი თქვენგანისთვის ნაცნობი. ჩვენ ღრმად გვწამს, რომ სასამართლოში არსებული პრობლემები დაკავშირებული არის იმასთან, რასაც მართვის სტილი ქვია, გადაწყვეტილების მიღების სტილი ქვია და სადაც კონსენსუსი არ მუშაობს, არამედ მუშაობს უმრავლესობის წესი. სწორედ ამიტომ სასამართლოში არსებული პრობლემები არის ჩიხი, საიდანაც ვერ გამოვდივართ. არ არის ნდობა და არ არის ნდობა მათ შორის საზოგადოებაში სასამართლოს მიმართ. გამოკვლევები აჩვენებს, რომ 50% საშუალოდ მოსახლეობის თვლის, რომ სასამართლოს მართავს კლანი ან სასამართლო პოლიტიკური ზეგავლენის ქვეშა. სწორედ ამიტომ მინდა ყურადღება გავამახვილო სამ ძირითად მიმართულებაზე, სადაც ჩვენ გვექნება რეკომენდაციები იმისთვის, რომ ეს მართვის სისტემა შეიცვალოს. პირველი ეს არის იუსტიციის უმაღლესი საბჭოს დაკომპლექტება, მეორე ეს არის სასამართლოში მოსამართლეთა დანიშვნა გათავისუფლების წესი და მესამე ეს არის ადმინისტრაციული თანამდებობების ზოგიერთი საკითხი. დღეს ჩვენთვის მთავარი გამოწვევა გახლავთ ის, რომ სასამართლოს აკონტროლებს კლანი, მოსამართლეთა გავლენიანი ჯგუფი, რომელიც სისტემას მართავს არა მართლმსაჯულების ინტერესების, არამედ პირადი გამორჩენის მიზნით. სწორედ ამ პრობლემების გადასაჭრელად ჩვენ მიგვაჩნია, რომ იუსტიციის უმაღლესი საბჭო უნდა დაკომპლექტდეს კონსენსუსის წესით, კერძოდ არამოსამართლე წევრები უნდა ავირჩიოთ ორმაგი მხარდაჭერით, როგორც ოპოზიციის, ისე ხელისუფლების მხარდაჭერით საქართველოს პარლამენტში. ეს იქნება პირველი ნაბიჯი, რომელიც შესაძლებლობას მოგცემს დავნიშნოთ ადამიანები, ვინცაც ექნება ნდობა და ვინც იქნება მიუკერძოებელი ამ პროცესში. ეს არის ჩვენი პირველი და ერთ-ერთი ყველაზე მნიშვნელოვანი რეკომენდაცია. მეორე საკითხი, ეს შეეხება მოსამართლეთა დანიშვნა გათავისუფლებას. აქაც ჩვენ გონია, რომ მთავარი პრობლემა გახლავთ უმრავლესობით გადაწყვეტილების მიღება. ეს უმრავლესობა მაღალია, თუმცა არ არის იმდენად მაღალი, რომ კონსენსუსს დაეფუძნოს მიღებული შედეგები. ამიტომ ჩვენ მიგვაჩნია და ჩვენი რეკომენდაცია არის ის, რომ გადაწყვეტილება მოსამართლეთა დანიშვნის შესახებ იუსტიციის უმაღლესმა საბჭომ მიიღოს ორმაგი 2/3-ით. როგორც მოსამართლე წევრების 2/3-ით, ისე არამოსამართლე წევრების 2/3-ით. და მესამე საკითხი ეს არის ადმინისტრაციული თანამდებობები. ადმინისტრაციული თანამდებობები მნიშვნელოვანი არის იმდენად, რამდენადაც ისინი სასამართლოს თავმჯდომარეები ამ შემთხვევაში გულისხმობ მათ მართავენ სასამართლოში არსებულ ვითარებას და ამისათვის საჭირო არის, რომ ისინი აირჩიონ თავად მოსამართლეებმა. მოსამართლეებმა უნდა გამოარჩიონ მათ შორის თავმჯდომარეები და ისინი ამავდროულად ზედიზედ ორჯერ არ შეიძლება აირჩეოდნენ. ეს არის ჩვენი მესამე რეკომენდაცია. საბოლოო ჯამში არსებული რეკომენდაციები ჩვენ მოგცემს იმის შესაძლებლობას, რომ კლანს გამოვაცალოთ ხელიდან სასამართლოს მართვის ბერკეტები. პირველი ბერკეტი ეს არის მოსამართლეთა დანიშვნა, ლოიალური პირების დანიშვნა სასამართლოში. მეორე ბერკეტი ეს არის სასამართლოს თავმჯდომარეების მეშვეობით მათი კონტროლი, ხოლო მესამე ბერკეტი, რომლის განადგურებაც ჩვენ გვსურს, ეს არის მოსამართლეთა დასჯის მექანიზმი მათი თანამდებობიდან გათავისუფლების მიზნით. აი, შემოთავაზებული სამი რეკომენდაცია ჩვენ მოგცემს შესაძლებლობას, რომ არსებული პრობლემები გადავჭრათ, სასამართლოში არსებული კლანური მმართველობა აღმოფხრათ, ხოლო საფუძვლად დავუდოთ ეს ცვლილებები ახალ რეფორმას, რომელიც მიგვიყვანს სასამართლოს სისტემის გაჯანსაღებამდე.
My name is Guram Imnadze and I speak on behalf of the Coalition for Independent and Transparent Judiciary. I believe that independent and politically neutral law enforcement system is the key element for democracy and human rights standards in the country. So I'll speak about the main institutional challenges existing in the prosecutor's office, police and state security service, and also discuss the risks of power abuse from these institutions. During the previous years, important institutional reforms have been implemented in these offices. For example, a prosecutorial council was established in the prosecutor's office, but the council is not politically neutral and doesn't have enough powers or mandate in order to guarantee the independence and effectiveness of the prosecutor's office. Furthermore, the head of the prosecutor's office, the prosecutor general, is appointed by simple majority of the parliament, which further increases of the political influences and risks of political influence over the office. Unbalanced power of state security service is one of the key and important challenge of human rights abuses in the country during the recent years. For example, state security service conducts investigations on particular crimes. It also is responsible to fight against corruption, to fight against terrorism, and conduct counterintelligence activities. But at the same time, the state security service is one of the most closed institutions in the country, and there is no strong and effective oversight mechanisms over its activities. Furthermore, head of the state security service is also appointed and dismissed by simple majority of the parliament, which further increases the political influences and risks of politicization of these institutions. It was important achievement when State Inspector's Office was empowered to investigate crimes committed law enforcement since 2019, but State Inspector's Service is not enabled to investigate all crimes committed by law enforcement institutions, and also it does not have power to conduct particular investigative activities without permission from the prosecutor. At the same time, inspector is also appointed by simple majority of the parliament, and it creates risks of politicization of her candidate. We therefore urge for the parliament to further increase oversight mechanisms over law enforcement institutions. Special committee should be established within the parliament in order to have effective and strong oversight mechanisms over state security service. State security service should be transferred mere analytical institutions. All the investigative powers should be diminished from these institutions, and it should be only oriented on the analytical works. Furthermore, how about State Inspector's Office? The inspector should be empowered to conduct investigation on all the crimes committed by law enforcement institutions, and also it should be enabled to conduct important investigative activities without permission of the prosecutor. Prosecutor General, head of the State Security Service, and State Inspector should be appointed based on the political consensus between the majority and opposition within the parliament. The full text of our recommendations is available on the UPR Info webpage, and thanks for your attention.
My name is Tamar Abazadze, and I will deliver this statement on behalf of Public Defender's Office of Georgia. This statement addresses the following issue: rights of prisoners in penitentiary institutions. This area of human rights contains a lot of sub-issues, and today I will talk about violence and problems related to identifying, documenting, and reporting incidents of violence to investigative authorities. Many countries during the second review urged Georgia to strengthen its efforts to combat ill treatment of prisoners and ensure that proper and thorough investigations are conducted in order to hold perpetrators accountable. In particular, 10 recommendations were given to Georgia on that issue. Public Defender notes that fight against ill treatment is considerably impeded by impunity of law enforcement officers for such crimes. The effectiveness of investigation is a systemic problem, as a result of which not a single law enforcement officer has been held responsible in criminal cases instituted based on Public Defender's 107 proposals submitted to the prosecutor's office in 2012-2019. The problem of violence is especially acute in the presence of informal rule in penitentiary institutions. Public defender has been pointing out that the informal rule existing in penitentiary institutions creates serious threats to ill treatment of prisoners. The informal rule often leads to interprisoner violence and bullying. With the influence of criminal subculture, prisoners are divided informally. The informal rule is manifested in taking punitive measures against those prisoners that disobey the informal rule. Inspection of penitentiary establishments revealed problems in the practice of medical professionals employed by the penitentiary establishments in identifying and documenting alleged incidents of ill treatment. In semi-open prison facilities, upon finding suspicious injury on a body of a prisoner, doctors do not document them in accordance with the procedure determined by Order number 131 of the Minister of Corrections and Probation of Georgia of 26 October 2016. In closed-type prison facilities, the injuries are documented only in those cases where at the time of admission at the establishment, an accused person reports ill treatment by police officers. Public defender notes that the faulty practice of documenting and identifying incidents of ill treatment, among other factors, is preconditioned by inadequate qualification of doctors, absence of confidential environment for doctor-prisoners meetings, the obligation to obtain informal consent from the prisoner, and many other normative shortcomings. Under current regulation, a doctor is still obliged to report alleged facts of ill treatment to the General Inspection of the Ministry of Justice, an agency institutionally linked to the penitentiary service, and not to the independent investigative body such as State Inspector Service. And of course, this process undermines the effectiveness of investigation of the facts of ill treatment of prisoners. As for the recommendations, in order to overcome criminal subculture and informal rule in the penitentiary institutions, we make following recommendations to the government of Georgia. Recommendation number 1, to the end of overcoming informal rule in penitentiary institutions, ensure elaboration of strategy in this regard. In order to identify cases of ill treatment effectively, we recommend to amend Order 131 of the Minister of Corrections and Probation of Georgia to the effect of determining the duty of a doctor to report the incidents of alleged ill treatment to the independent investigative body, State Inspector Service. Thank you for your attention.
My name is Kamran Mehmedli. This statement is delivered on behalf of Salam Platform, a grassroots community organization established to protect and advocate for the rights of ethnic minorities in Georgia. The report I'm going to present was developed by an inclusive coalition of human rights organizations as well as religious organizations engaged in rights protection. As a result of our discussions, we came up with several recommendations, of which I will share a few. I will cover 3 issues. First of all, the political and civic participation of ethnic minorities. Secondly, the issue of law enforcement and ethnic minorities. And lastly, employment of ethnic minorities in the public offices. Unfortunately, ethnic minorities are perceived as threat, danger, or guests in the country. Ethnic minorities are being seen as less educated, less cultured, or less civilized people who are the second-class citizens of the country. A good example of that would be the period of COVID-19, when the vast majority of Georgian public, including some high-level public officials, accused ethnic minorities of being the cause of the spread of the virus. As a result of that, Georgian government put strict quarantine in the regions, in the municipalities of ethnic minorities. As a result of this quarantine, as a result of the worsened economic conditions and perceived ethnic discriminations, ethnic minorities region faced civic unrest and demonstration during the pandemic period. I'd like to thank to many countries who recommended to Georgia on the issues of ethnic minorities on the second review. However, Georgia didn't take any transformative or specific steps towards the inclusion of minorities. We don't have any mechanisms for consultation with the legislative or executive branches of government, nor we have the consultative mechanisms on the local municipal levels in Georgia where ethnic minorities reside. So we, Salam Platform and the coalition, recommend the Georgian government to establish mechanism for consultation with ethnic minorities on the level of central government, legislative and executive branches of the government, as well as municipalities on the municipal level where ethnic minorities reside. The second issue I would like to highlight is the issue of the security approach of the law enforcement officials of Georgia. Ethnic minorities are perceived danger in the country, as danger to the national interests of Georgia. A good example of that would be the state policy in Pankesi Gorge, where ethnic Kists reside. Several cases was when ethnic minority activists and religious leaders were interrogated by state security services. And also we observed the cases where state security services treated equally ethnic minority activists and racist groups. Therefore, we recommend Georgian government to remove equality-related cases from the mandate of state security services. The final issue, the last but not least issue I would like to talk about is the employment of ethnic minorities. We don't have any data revealing the number of ethnic minorities working in public offices. And when we apply to the government offices asking for the information, they say that we don't discriminate ethnic minorities, our public servants, based on their ethnic backgrounds. However, we are blind in this situation where we don't see how many ethnic minorities work in the public offices. But we know for sure, we believe that ethnic minorities lack the employment in the public offices. Therefore, we recommend the Georgian government to reveal the statistical data showing and presenting ethnic minorities' employment rate in the public offices. Therefore, we recommend Georgian government to adopt statistical data revealing the number of ethnic minorities employed in public offices. Thanks for your attention. You can find the rest of our recommendation in our report.
I'm Mako Gavtadze from Tolerance and Diversity Institute. The organization is the member of Coalition for Equality. The coalition made joint submission for the UPR. I will speak about two topics. One is freedom of religion and belief and the rights of religious minorities in Georgia, and another is racism, rights of migrants, and the rise of extremist and populist groups in Georgia. As for religious freedom in Georgia, there are many systemic problems that has been underlined by the public defender, by religious communities and the civil society organizations on many occasions, but they are not addressed by the government properly. I will underline as the problems related to the property rights of religious communities, the unsecular environment in Georgia's public schools, investigation of the crimes committed, hate crimes committed on the ground of religious intolerance, also the discrimination in the legislation and the state policy. As for the state policy, the good reflection, what is the approach of the states towards religious minority communities, we can discuss it, how the state agency for religious issues is functioning and what is the role and what is the attitude of the agency towards religious minority communities in Georgia. The agency that was set up under the Prime Minister's office in 2014 chose not to base its activities on human rights and freedom of religion, and it it looks at religious minority communities from security perspective, and it has proven it on many occasions. That is why we recommend that the state agency has to be abolished, and instead the government has to increase its cooperation with the Council of Religions that is functioning under the Public Defender's Ombudsperson's Office of Georgia. Another problem, the discrimination in Georgian legislation, I will underline mainly the state property law and the tax legislation, which is utterly discriminatory towards religious groups. Only the Georgian Orthodox Church enjoys certain rights and privileges while others cannot. That is why the Parliament has to address this problem promptly and to eliminate discrimination in the Georgian legislation. As for the property rights, the restitution of the property for religious minority communities confiscated during the Soviet times is very problematic, and also when the religious minority groups try to build new places of worship, they face many artificial obstacles from the state. That is why the state has to eliminate all kind of discrimination and to resolve all property-related problems for religious minority organizations. As for racism, it has become very problematic during the last years, and the rise of extremism and populist groups has proven that there is a lack of the government, there is a lack of will that to address the activities of these extremist groups. In 2018, the members of such groups murdered a young human rights activist, Vitaly Safarov. Another problem faced by foreign nationals in Georgia, especially these are people from African, Asian and Arabic countries, is when they try to get residence permits in Georgia. Very often the state's response is negative, and the reason of the state, the reason for rejection is national security concern. While the state cannot prove in fact why the national security concern is so important in so many cases, in 99% of the cases of rejection. That is why we recommend that the state should elaborate very clear anti-racism policy and to implement it in investigative institutions and in all levels of the governments. Also to eliminate discriminatory approach towards foreign nationals when they try to get residence permits, asylum and so on. This is very briefly that I wanted to underline very briefly the systemic problems related to freedom of religion and racism, and you can find more in our joint submission of the Coalition for Equality that is available at the UPR Info's website. I'm really grateful for your attention, and I'm looking forward to further cooperation. Thank you.